Imagine the scene unfolding in those first days after Germany surrendered. The symbols of the regime had been torn down, the military parades had ceased, and the echoing boots of the rallies had finally fallen silent. Across cities like Frankfurt, Munich, and Nuremberg, German civilians emerged from their homes, exhausted and hungry, only to witness something they had never anticipated. Walking through their streets were American military personnel, tall and commanding in their crisp uniforms, carrying themselves with the confidence that comes with victory. But what struck many of these civilians was something they couldn't quite process at first. A significant number of these officers, the men now directing traffic in their cities and organizing relief efforts, were Jewish. Consider what must have run through the minds of ordinary Germans in those moments. For more than a decade, they had been subjected to relentless messaging that painted Jews as fundamentally weak, incapable of courage, devoid of leadership qualities, and essentially parasitic in nature. The entire propaganda apparatus had worked over time to convince them that Jews represented everything opposite to strength and authority. Yet here they stood, face to face with reality. Jewish Americans wearing officer insignia, backed by the most powerful military force on earth, giving orders in German cities. The collision between what they had been taught and what they now witnessed must have been staggering. What makes this historical moment particularly remarkable is that the American military wasn't just tolerating Jewish officers as some token presence. The ranks were genuinely filled with them. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, thousands upon thousands of Jewish Americans had rushed to volunteer for service. Many distinguished themselves in combat and training, and a substantial portion climbed the ranks to become officers, serving as captains, majors, and some even reaching the rank of colonel. The numbers tell the story clearly. More than 500,000 Jews served in the United States Armed Forces throughout the entire war, and approximately 50,000 of them held officer commissions. This meant that in the occupied German cities of 1945, the likelihood of any civilian encountering a Jewish officer was remarkably high, not some rare exception. To understand the full impact, consider real examples. Captain Felix Sparks, who would later be recognized for his role in liberating Dachau, served alongside numerous Jewish officers who commanded infantry companies. Major Murray Shubin led armored units into battle, while Colonel Harry Henschel managed critical logistical operations that kept the Allied advance moving across Europe. When German civilians found themselves standing before these men, receiving ration slips signed by Jewish officers, obtaining permits from Jewish administrators, or being questioned by Jewish interrogators, the cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. Everything they thought they knew was being dismantled before their eyes. The irony cuts even deeper when you consider the personal histories involved. Many of these American Jewish officers were themselves the children of immigrants who had fled from Germany or Poland just years before, sometimes only a decade earlier. Their families had been stripped of citizenship, dignity, and any sense of safety under the laws enacted by the regime. Now their sons returned, not as the victims the Reich had tried to create, but as liberators wearing American uniforms and carrying the authority of commanders. Think about the symbolism inherent in that reversal. The very people the regime had declared racially inferior, unfit for society, were now issuing orders to former party members and demanding discipline in cities that had once displayed massive anti-Semitic propaganda. This wasn't merely symbolic theatre. Documentary evidence shows German civilians whispering among themselves when they learned an officer's surname. Names like Levine, Cohen, or Goldberg sparked immediate recognition. Some civilians even asked directly, unable to contain their disbelief, whether the officer was indeed Jewish. They seemed to expect denials or evasions, but these officers didn't hesitate. Many answered with pride, fully aware that their mere presence was systematically dismantling the propaganda narrative that had been forced into German minds for 12 years. The myth of the weak, cowardly Jew collapsed in real time, and standing at the center of that collapse were young men from Brooklyn, Chicago, or Los Angeles whose parents had once packed everything into suitcases and fled across the Atlantic. Now they had returned to ensure Germany could never rise in the same terrible way again. This is where the story truly begins, with that pivotal moment when a defeated nation had to confront its conquerors and realize an uncomfortable truth. The people they had spent years demonizing were among the strongest voices of victory, wearing the uniforms of authority and carrying the power to reshape Germany's future. For years leading up to that shocking realization, German civilians had lived in an environment saturated with toxic propaganda. From the moment the regime seized power in 1933, an entire media apparatus had been constructed with one purpose: to vilify Jews at every turn. School textbooks branded them as degenerates. Posters displayed grotesque caricatures on every street corner. Radio broadcasts constantly warned that Jews secretly manipulated governments and controlled financial systems worldwide. By the time war broke out in 1939, this bombardment had become the only reality most Germans knew or could remember. So picture the scene in 1945. The regime lay in absolute ruins, cities reduced to rubble and ash, families torn apart by years of conflict. Then, on streets covered in debris in Berlin or Cologne, a German shopkeeper suddenly realizes that the American officer politely asking for directions or signing off on food distribution paperwork bears an obviously Jewish surname. In that single instant, years upon years of indoctrination shatter. The Jew who was supposedly incapable of military discipline or leadership is now wearing officers' insignia and directly managing the reconstruction of Germany itself. This wasn't some abstract concept to debate. It was lived reality unfolding every single day. In April 1945, as American troops pushed into Bavaria, civilians encountered Jewish officers leading entire battalions into towns like Landsberg and Augsburg. For locals who had grown up seeing Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer newspaper on every corner, spewing venom about Jews as cowardly manipulators hiding in shadows, the contrast was absolutely staggering. These men weren't cowardly in any sense. They were decisive, confident, and clearly respected by the soldiers under their command. They weren't lurking in shadows. They were leading from the very front of military operations. Consider the case of Major Benjamin Abramson, who oversaw key aspects of military government operations in occupied German territory. His presence alone, a Jewish man wielding authority over former regime members, completely upended every line of propaganda civilians had absorbed. Civilian clerks who had once dutifully copied regime decrees now found themselves taking orders from a man whose people the Reich had attempted to annihilate entirely. The humiliation of that reversal wasn't lost on anyone involved. The shock factor multiplies when you remember that the propaganda hadn't only characterized Jews as weak. It had framed the entire war as a defensive struggle against them. The propaganda ministers' speeches had repeatedly presented the conflict as a Jewish conspiracy, allegedly orchestrated by shadowy financiers manipulating world events. Ordinary Germans had been told that America was essentially a puppet state controlled by Jewish interests. But when actual Jewish American officers appeared in their towns, it wasn't in secret meetings or hidden locations. It was in broad daylight, in full uniform, disciplined and professional, armed with the authority of the world's most powerful military force. The result was cognitive dissonance on a truly national scale. Some civilians, especially those who still clung desperately to regime ideology, simply refused to believe what they were seeing. Others were forced into an extremely uncomfortable reckoning. If Jews could successfully command troops, organize massive relief efforts, and rebuild destroyed cities with competence and efficiency, then the entire narrative drilled into them for 12 solid years had been nothing but lies from beginning to end. That realization didn't just chip away at the regime's ideology, it shattered it completely. Think about the conversations that must have been whispered in kitchens and ration distribution lines. A German woman might lean close to her neighbor and say quietly, "The American captain handling housing permits, his name is Cohen. Can you believe that?" and the neighbour, perhaps still desperately clinging to old beliefs, might struggle to process the devastating truth that they had been fooled, manipulated, and led into catastrophe by a system built entirely on hatred. Long before those confrontations in occupied Germany in 1945, there was a history that made such encounters possible in the first place. The waves of Jewish immigration to the United States had started in the late 19th century and accelerated dramatically after 1900. Jewish families fled persecution, pogroms, and systemic discrimination throughout Eastern Europe, Germany, and Austria. By the 1920s, more than 3 million Jews had arrived in America, carving out new lives in cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. These weren't easy beginnings by any measure. Many immigrants settled in crowded tenement buildings, worked exhausting hours in garment factories, or operated small shops to support their families. But they invested heavily in education, with parents pushing their children toward universities, law schools, and professional careers. That investment paid off substantially. By the 1930s, the sons of those immigrants were entering the United States military, not merely as enlisted privates, but increasingly as officers. These were educated men who had mastered English, earned university degrees, and proven their leadership potential through various channels. What's especially striking is the timing of this development. As the regime in Germany was stripping Jews of citizenship through the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, America was simultaneously commissioning Jewish graduates from West Point, Yale, and Columbia as military officers. The paths diverged dramatically. In Berlin, Jewish students were being expelled from schools and universities. In New York, Jewish students were being trained to lead battalions and command naval vessels. When Austria was annexed in 1938, the refugee crisis intensified dramatically. Thousands of Austrian and German Jews desperately sought entry into the United States. While American immigration quotas limited the numbers who could enter, those who managed to escape often sent their children into military service as a way to demonstrate loyalty to their new homeland. By the outbreak of global war, there existed an entire generation of Jewish Americans whose parents or grandparents had fled Europe. Their motivation to serve wasn't abstract patriotism. It was deeply personal. They were fighting the very ideology that had driven their families from their homes and threatened their relatives who remained behind. Take someone like Lieutenant Colonel Leon Bass. Though born in Philadelphia, he grew up hearing stories about the struggles of relatives still in Europe. When he marched into Germany with the United States Army, he carried not just the American flag but also the burden of his family's history. Or consider the countless Jewish officers whose parents had emigrated from Poland, Hungary, or Russia, lands that would later be scarred by regime occupation. Their heritage made the war more than a professional duty. It became a personal mission. It's worth noting the cultural transformation at play in American society during this period. Jewish immigrants had climbed from outsider status to full civic participation within just a few decades. By 1941, 500,000 Jews were serving in the armed forces, and tens of thousands of those were officers. That sheer scale meant that when American forces landed in North Africa in 1942, stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, and occupied Germany in 1945, Jewish officers were always present in significant numbers. For German civilians who had believed Jews were incapable of even commanding themselves, learning that so many of America's battlefield leaders were Jewish was utterly unthinkable. Yet the seeds of that shock had been planted decades earlier, when desperate families boarded steamships in Hamburg and Bremen carrying nothing but hope, and landed at Ellis Island with dreams of safety and opportunity. Those children of immigrants grew up to wear officer stripes and ultimately to walk back into Germany, not as refugees fleeing persecution, but as victors carrying the authority of liberation. The irony is impossible to miss. The very policies that forced Jews out of Europe in the 1930s helped ensure that just a decade later, Jewish American officers would return with the power of liberation firmly in their hands. By the time American forces surged across Europe in 1944 and into 1945, Jewish Americans were not only present throughout the military ranks, they were actively shaping the course of the fight. Their contributions extended far beyond simple numbers. They played crucial roles in intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and direct frontline combat. To German civilians who had been conditioned for over a decade to believe Jews were incapable of courage or leadership, this reality was absolutely stunning. Let's examine the raw figures first. More than 500,000 Jewish Americans served throughout the entire duration of the war. Out of these, approximately 50,000 rose to become officers, men commanding platoons, companies, and even entire regiments. This wasn't tokenism or symbolic representation. Jewish officers were leading troops into battle, directing artillery fire during engagements, and coordinating complex supply lines that kept armies moving. Their names appear throughout after-action reports of major campaigns, from North Africa in 1942 through the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Consider Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Mashbeer, who worked extensively in military intelligence operations, initially in the Pacific Theater and later in Europe. His expertise in languages and analytical skills helped American forces crack enemy communications and anticipate troop movements. Or Major Murray Shubin, who commanded armoured units that rolled directly into Germany in the spring of 1945. Their very existence disproved every piece of propaganda that had been spread for years. Here were Jewish officers, respected by the men under their command and trusted with life-or-death decisions on a daily basis. One of the most famous examples is General Morris Rose, who became the highest-ranking Jewish officer killed during the entire war. He commanded the 3rd Armoured Division, one of the spearhead units that broke through German defences. Rose was renowned throughout the army for his personal bravery and exceptional leadership, often positioning himself at the very front with his troops rather than directing from behind the lines. When he was killed in March 1945, even enemy forces recognized the magnitude of the loss. For German civilians who later learned about his background, the idea that a Jewish man had led such a formidable and effective force was almost impossible to reconcile with years of propaganda lies. Beyond the battlefield, Jewish officers excelled particularly in intelligence and interrogation roles. Fluent in German or Yiddish, many were specifically recruited to question prisoners of war and analyze captured documents for useful information. These officers, sometimes called the Ritchie Boys after their training facility at Camp Ritchie in Maryland, became a secret weapon for Allied intelligence. Many of them had fled the regime as children, only to return years later as United States officers with deep understanding of the culture, language, and psychology. Their intelligence work proved critical in predicting German troop deployments and systematically dismantling command structures. To the average German civilian, the discovery that an American officer questioning them or organizing post-war relief efforts was Jewish created an immediate clash with everything they had been told their entire adult lives. Here was a man who spoke fluent German, understood their culture intimately, and yet commanded clear authority backed by the victorious Allies. The contradiction was simply unavoidable. It wasn't only in intelligence or combat operations. Jewish officers also played highly visible roles in rebuilding occupied Germany. They were present in military government units tasked with re-establishing order, distributing food rations, and setting up new local administrations. For a German mayor who had once signed regime decrees without question, being told what to do by a Jewish American officer represented the ultimate reversal of fortune imaginable. What ties all these elements together is visibility. These officers weren't hidden behind the scenes in supporting roles. They were on the front lines during combat, in command posts making strategic decisions, in town halls administering civilian affairs, and at checkpoints controlling movement. Their presence was undeniable and unavoidable. With every encounter, the regime's myths crumbled further. The propaganda had promised that Jews were fundamentally unfit to lead in any capacity. The battlefield and the subsequent occupation proved exactly the opposite. For German civilians, the shock wasn't merely in seeing that Jewish officers existed, it was in realizing they excelled at their duties. They were decorated with medals for valor, promoted for demonstrated bravery, and entrusted with command over thousands of soldiers. In the span of a single war, Jewish Americans dismantled centuries of stereotypes and lies by showing, through direct action, what propaganda could never erase: genuine competence, authentic courage, and natural leadership ability. Once the fighting finally stopped and American forces occupied German territory, the interactions between civilians and Jewish American officers became part of daily reality. These weren't dramatic moments on some distant battlefield anymore. They were face-to-face encounters in ruined cities, in town squares littered with rubble, and in makeshift administrative offices where the conquerors and the conquered had to coexist and interact regularly. In those encounters, German civilians gradually came to realize that many of the officers giving them orders, issuing necessary permits, and literally deciding their immediate futures were Jewish. Think of a German farmer in 1945 walking into a requisition office. He needs permission to keep part of his harvest to feed his family. Sitting behind the desk is a United States Army captain with a nameplate reading Lieutenant Cohen. The farmer, conditioned by 12 years of relentless rhetoric, almost can't process what he's seeing. A Jew in direct command of food distribution. Yet there it is, undeniable reality. The officer speaks calmly and professionally, enforces regulations fairly and consistently, and demonstrates exactly the kind of discipline and authority that civilians had been told for years that Jews never possessed. That contradiction played out thousands and thousands of times across occupied Germany. One group that made these encounters especially striking were the Ritchie boys, many of whom had been promoted to officer ranks during their service. These were Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who had fled the regime's persecution, grown up in America, and then returned wearing uniforms. Fluent in German, they often served as interpreters and interrogators. Imagine being a German civilian stopped at a checkpoint by an American lieutenant who not only speaks absolutely perfect German but also has a distinctly Jewish surname. The psychological whiplash must have been overwhelming for many. There are first-hand accounts that illustrate these moments vividly. In occupied Bavaria, some civilians admitted to whispering among themselves when they saw American officers with names like Kaplan, Rosen, or Goldberg. They expected hostility from these men, perhaps personal revenge for what had been done. But instead, many Jewish officers acted with strict professionalism, enforcing United States military law rather than seeking personal vengeance. That professionalism cut even deeper into the regime's lies. How could the so-called enemies of civilization behave with more fairness and restraint than the government Germans had just served and lost under? At the same time, there were moments of visible and intentional tension. Some Jewish American officers did not hide their heritage in any way. They carried themselves with obvious pride, sometimes even making a point of letting civilians know directly who they were. A colonel in charge of reconstruction efforts once informed a German town council that he was the son of immigrants from Frankfurt who had been driven out by anti-Semitic laws, and now he had returned with full authority. The room reportedly fell into complete silence. Encounters like this were far more than simple bureaucratic exchanges. They were living lessons in history's cruel reversals. German civilians also witnessed Jewish chaplains, often holding officer rank, leading religious services for American troops right in the heart of defeated Germany. To walk past a bombed-out church and hear Hebrew prayers being sung openly under United States military protection must have been an unimaginable scene for many. The very faith the regime had tried to erase from Europe was now being openly practiced, guarded by armed American soldiers in the cities where persecution had been planned. Every interaction, whether at a food distribution line, a requisition office, or a town hall meeting, chipped away at old prejudices that had been carefully cultivated. Civilians were forced to reconcile the propaganda they had lived under with the reality standing directly in front of them. Some did so quietly, perhaps with shame. Others resisted internally, whispering disbelief to trusted friends. But absolutely no one could ignore the truth. Jewish officers were present, and they were firmly in charge of occupation operations. So in these face-to-face encounters, the propaganda war finally collapsed at the most human level possible. No more posters on walls, no more speeches broadcast on radios. Just the lived experience of taking orders from men whose very existence refuted more than a decade of systematic lies. The reality was unavoidable and undeniable. As the United States Army advanced deeper into German territory during the spring of 1945, another layer of this historical story unfolded, one that carries even more emotional weight. Jewish American officers were among the very first Allied soldiers to enter and liberate the concentration camps. For them, this wasn't just another military assignment to be completed. It was a moment of profound personal confrontation. To walk into places like Dachau, Buchenwald, or Mauthausen, to see emaciated survivors barely clinging to life, and to know that they were witnessing the fate their own relatives might have shared had their families not escaped to America in time. The encounters were unforgettable for everyone involved. When Jewish officers first met survivors in these camps, there was often an immediate sense of recognition and connection. A soldier named Rosen or Kaplan could speak Yiddish or German fluently, bridging the gap instantly. Survivors, many of whom had lost absolutely everything and everyone they loved, sometimes broke down completely when they realized their liberator was a fellow Jew, not only alive and well, but wearing a uniform and carrying the authority of the United States Army. These were moments of almost biblical symbolism playing out in real time. The persecuted and the exiled returning as liberators with power and authority. One particularly striking example comes from the liberation of Dachau in April 1945. Jewish American soldiers and officers entered the camp and were immediately stunned by the sheer horror of what they found. Captain Abraham Levine, one of the officers present that day, later recalled the chilling silence of survivors who were too weak to even cheer their liberation. When he began speaking to them in Yiddish, some wept uncontrollably, not only from relief but from the profound shock of hearing their ancestral language spoken by a man in an American uniform. That detail, the language connection, mattered deeply. It was living proof that the Jewish people had not been erased from the earth as the regime had intended. The power dynamic was absolutely staggering for German civilians as well. Towns located near concentration camps were often forced by Allied authorities to walk through the gates and see the atrocities firsthand, to confront what had been done. Imagine being a villager from Dachau, herded into the camp by American troops, and suddenly realizing that the officer commanding the inspection tour was Jewish. The very people who had been demonized in all the propaganda were now personally showing Germans the monstrous reality of what had been done in their name. The humiliation and the moral reckoning collided in those moments with devastating force. For the Jewish officers themselves, the experience was inevitably a mix of triumph and deep trauma. Some wrote in their personal diaries about the profound pride of wearing the United States uniform while liberating fellow Jews from these death camps. Others admitted to feeling overwhelming rage mixed with despair as they saw the true scale of the destruction and calculated murder. Many of these officers carried survivor testimonies back to their units and to military leadership, helping the world begin to understand what the Holocaust truly meant in human terms. One aspect that often gets overlooked is the role Jewish chaplains who held officer rank played during these liberations. They immediately organized proper burials for the countless dead, offered prayers for survivors, and worked to re-establish Jewish religious services right inside the liberated camps. To stand under the open sky of Buchenwald and hear the Kaddish prayer led by an American Jewish chaplain was an act of profound spiritual defiance. It declared clearly and loudly that the regime had failed in its ultimate goal. The Jewish people survived. For German civilians watching all of this unfold before their eyes, the experience was psychologically shattering. To see Jewish American officers not only in positions of command, but serving as the direct antithesis of every regime lie, demonstrating compassion, exercising authority, and displaying deep humanity, left very little room for continued denial. It was no longer remotely possible to claim ignorance or to cling desperately to stereotypes. The reality was right in front of them, undeniable. Jews were not helpless victims in this scenario. They were leaders, soldiers, and liberators with the power to reshape Europe. This collision, where persecution transformed into liberation, where powerlessness turned into authority, made the Jewish presence in the United States Officer Corps far more than just a military fact for historians to note. It became a profound moral statement, written permanently into the ruins of the fallen Reich. The symbolic weight of that reversal would echo through decades of German consciousness. By late summer of 1945, once the guns had gone completely quiet and the regime had fully collapsed into dust, the psychological fallout from discovering Jewish American officers weighed heavily on German civilians in ways both obvious and subtle. The realization wasn't simply surprising or unexpected. It struck directly at the very foundation of what they had been systematically taught to believe for over a decade. Regime propaganda had painted Jews as parasites who weakened and destroyed nations. Now, confronted with undeniable facts, Germans saw that Jews had stood at the heart of the very army that utterly crushed the Reich. This was more than mere humiliation. It forced a confrontation with truth itself. In cities like Frankfurt and Munich, people whispered about the Jewish officers working in command posts and administrative buildings. Some clung desperately to denial, insisting it must be Allied propaganda designed specifically to humiliate them further. But others, especially younger Germans and those who had grown weary of the endless lies, began to realize how thoroughly and completely deceived they had been. If Jews could successfully lead battalions, interrogate generals with authority, and administer entire towns efficiently, then absolutely every lesson drilled into them since 1933 had been fundamentally false from the start. The shock ran even deeper in rural communities and smaller villages. In places where regime ideology had gone essentially unquestioned for years, people often first encountered Jewish officers through reconstruction efforts, ration distribution systems, housing permit offices, or denazification hearings. The authority these officers exercised turned propaganda completely upside down. Ordinary Germans had to process the reality that men they had been told were subhuman were now calmly and confidently managing the entire rebuilding of their nation. That contradiction forced a deep reckoning. If the regime had lied so fundamentally about Jews, what else had they lied about? What other beliefs were built on sand? There were moments when the impact became intensely personal. Survivors of this period recall Germans expressing genuine disbelief that an officer named Goldberg or Rosenbaum could possibly be Jewish because he simply didn't fit the grotesque caricatures that had been plastered on propaganda posters for years. To see a disciplined, professionally decorated officer in command didn't align at all with the images from regime newspapers. And once that illusion cracked, the entire edifice of regime ideology began to wobble and eventually collapse. This psychological shock also rippled powerfully into post-war justice proceedings. During interrogations of former regime officials, some Jewish officers directly confronted men who had once signed anti-Semitic decrees into law. Imagine being a former secret police officer questioned by an American major whose family name immediately revealed his Jewish heritage. That reversal carried symbolic weight far beyond that single room. It signaled the complete collapse of regime myths, not just in abstract theory, but in living, breathing reality that couldn't be denied. Children absorbed these contradictions as well. In schools that reopened under Allied supervision, German children sometimes slowly realized that their teachers, now retrained under American oversight, had to answer to Jewish officers in the military government. That inversion of authority planted seeds of doubt about the entire worldview they had inherited from their parents. For some young people, it became the first step toward fundamentally rejecting the ideology their families had embraced. Of course, not all reactions were acceptance or enlightenment. Pockets of bitter resentment certainly lingered in various communities. Some Germans quietly resented what they saw as the humiliation of being overseen by Jewish officers, muttering privately that it was revenge disguised as liberation. But even that bitterness implicitly acknowledged the undeniable fact that Jews were present, visible, and powerful in the new order being established. Whether that authority was accepted gracefully or resisted bitterly, it could not be denied or wished away. In the end, the discovery that so many United States officers were Jewish reshaped the German psychological landscape in ways both subtle and profound that would echo for generations. It forced civilians to directly confront the lies they had lived under, made them wrestle uncomfortably with the morality of their nation's actions, and planted the first seeds of doubt that would, over time and with much difficulty, grow into the cultural re-examination of the regime years that Germany would eventually undertake. For a people emerging physically from rubble and emotionally from catastrophe, that reckoning was every bit as important as any physical rebuilding of cities and infrastructure. When the dust of war finally settled across Europe, the presence of Jewish officers in the United States Army became far more than just a wartime footnote for history books. It carried a lasting legacy that fundamentally reshaped how Germany, and indeed the world, viewed Jews in the modern era. For Germans specifically, the revelation that Jews had not only survived the regime's systematic attempt to eradicate them entirely, but had returned in positions of genuine authority was a shock with generational consequences. For Jews worldwide, it served as powerful proof that survival could indeed transform into triumph. In post-war Germany, this legacy lingered in the fabric of everyday life. German civilians who had once marched enthusiastically under regime banners now had to watch Jewish officers oversee reconstruction projects, sit on military tribunals judging war crimes, and administer comprehensive denazification programs. The lesson was utterly unavoidable. The myths that had been used to justify a genocidal regime were gone, exposed as lies. Over time, that reality worked its way slowly and painfully into the national consciousness. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, as West Germany rebuilt itself under Allied supervision and guidance, acknowledgement of Jewish contributions to liberation gradually became part of the slow, difficult reckoning with the past. On a broader international scale, the role of Jewish American officers helped significantly strengthen the moral position of the Allied victory in world opinion. At the Nuremberg trials, Jewish officers and interpreters were absolutely central to the entire process of bringing justice. Some had grown up in German-speaking households, fled the Reich as refugees, and now sat directly across from regime war criminals, ensuring their words were faithfully and accurately recorded for history. This wasn't vengeance being extracted, it was justice being carried out under international law. And it demonstrated powerfully that Jews were not merely passive victims of history, but active participants in shaping its course toward justice. For the Jewish community worldwide, this historical moment was genuinely transformative in its psychological impact. The Holocaust had very nearly annihilated European Jewry entirely. But the visibility of Jewish American officers in victory gave survivors and Jewish communities everywhere a profound sense of pride and vindication. It showed that Jews could wield power honorably and effectively, defend their people when necessary, and stand confidently at the center of world events rather than at the margins. In many ways, these officers symbolized resilience itself, the children of desperate immigrants who returned to Europe not in chains or as refugees, but in command, with authority and dignity. The legacy also reached back across the Atlantic Ocean to reshape American society. In America, Jewish veterans of the war, including thousands of officers, returned home to a country that increasingly began to see them in a fundamentally new light. Their service records, their medals, their personal sacrifices, and their demonstrated competence helped break down long-standing barriers of anti-Semitism that had existed in American society for generations. By the post-war years, Jewish Americans were increasingly visible in politics, business, academia, and popular culture. Their military contributions provided undeniable proof of patriotism and belonging that couldn't be dismissed. For Germans, the memory was considerably harder to process and integrate. The shock of seeing Jewish officers in 1945 became a long-term reminder, passed quietly through families and communities, of just how deeply regime propaganda had lied to them. The humiliation embedded in that realization helped fuel, slowly and unevenly, the cultural shift that eventually made post-war Germany capable of confronting its past honestly. In classrooms decades later, children would learn not only about the Holocaust's horrors, but also about the profound irony that Jews returned as liberators rather than remaining as victims. That irony carried a moral weight far heavier than any Allied tank rolling through city streets. In the final analysis, the presence of Jewish officers in the United States Army during and after the war symbolized the complete collapse of the Reich's darkest and most fundamental lies. It proved definitively that hatred had failed, that survival had transformed into genuine strength, and that history's cruelest reversal had indeed come true. The people who were meant to be erased from existence had walked back into Germany carrying authority, administering justice, and maintaining their dignity throughout. For civilians who lived through that experience firsthand, the lesson was absolutely unforgettable and would shape their understanding for the rest of their lives. And for the world watching these events unfold, it remains to this day one of the most powerful testaments to human resilience in the face of systematic, murderous hatred. The children of refugees became the liberators, and in that transformation they rewrote what had seemed like an inevitable tragedy into a story of survival, resistance, and ultimately justice prevailing over tyranny.